So hello and welcome to today's featured speaker seminar by ADBI. My name is John Byrne, Vice Chair of Research here at ADBI. Today we're delighted to welcome Alex Plekhanov from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, who will present EBRD's 2022-23 transition report on the policy implications of business unusual conditions in the global economy. Just some words about the speaker. So Alex is the Director of Transition Impact and Global Economics at the EBRD in London. He edits the EBRD's annual economic report, the Transition Report, and Regional Economic Prospects Report. Previously, he covered economic developments in Russia, Belarus, Mongolia, Central Asia, and a number of other economies. He joined EBRD in October 2007, and prior to that, he worked as an economist at the International Monetary Fund. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Cambridge. I'll now hand the floor to Alex, who will spend the next 45 minutes or so on his presentation, and we will then have Q&A. So please, Alex, go ahead. Thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure to be here in Tokyo and to share with you some of our work that we've been doing at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development as part of our annual economic report, Business Unusual, that came out on Tuesday this week, and also some work that we've been doing on the shifting patterns of trade in Central Asia and the Caucasus, the region that we have in common with the Asian Development Bank, and I will touch upon that as well. I very much welcome questions as we go along, and I will try to monitor the chat box to the best of my ability. So hopefully you can see the slides, and let's see if I can, yeah, perfect. So the report really is a collection of 5 chapters that cover 5 extraordinary disruptions to how business is conducted in emerging Europe, Central Asia, North Africa. The war that rages in Europe has resulted in the largest forced displacement of people in Europe since the 1940s. That came in addition to major disruptions that COVID-19 has caused to supply chains. And at the same time, governments and companies also ended up with exceptionally high levels of debt accumulated at exceptionally favorable terms. So we cover all of these developments, and we also look at historically high energy prices, in particular gas prices in Europe, and measures that governments adopted in response to those prices. So the first chapter is a retrospective of a history of wars, a history where we have data for 200 years or so, and we look at what has happened. Interstate wars between different countries have become somewhat less common than they used to be, but civil wars have not. And if anything, they have become more frequent since 1980s, 1990s, coming back to levels of perhaps 19th century. What we see is a very large variation in the economic effects of war, and that you can see on this chart as well when it comes to a cumulative income per capita drop during the span of the conflict. And what we do are looking at some stylized facts and averages and how wars are financed. In general, as wars go on for longer, foreign funding tends to give way to domestic financing, and domestic financing mostly takes form of borrowing, because raising taxes is hard, and printing money was only popular around the Second World War, as it usually results in hyperinflation. So as a result, inflation tends to spike during wars by around 8 percentage points or so. That being said, after the war ends, it comes down to the level that one can be expected in similar economies quite fast. Average debt to GDP increases by around 47 percentage points during the conflict and immediately after. And that takes a long way to come down. It starts going down towards the level of the comparator economies, but at least 5 years after the war, you still see very significant differences. And in roughly half of the cases, GDP per capita remains below what can be expected based on synthetic comparators. So a trend seen in economies that are similar in many ways to economies that were in conflict. So in half of the cases, income per capita does not return to pre-war trend after 25 years. In around 20% of the cases, reconstruction actually happens fast, and in around 5 years, economies revert to trend. Perhaps the stylized fact that personally surprised me most is how elusive peace is. So only 20% of wars end and are followed by 25 years of peace. In a lot of cases, wars are recurrent and happen fairly soon after one war ends. And that basically is also probably why it is so difficult to achieve lasting reconstruction. Even where the income per capita recovers, wars leave lasting scars in terms of capital and population and labor force. People migrate, populations shrink considerably, and capital stock gets destroyed during conflict, and on average is never rebuilt to the levels that could be expected in similar economies. The corollary of that, of course, is that economies become a bit more efficient in how they use capital stock and labor, and in some cases manage to compensate through total factor productivity for the disruption, the destruction of capital. But it doesn't really happen all the time. So the second chapter looks at patterns of migration. And here, migration, international migration and the internally displaced people migration has really picked up in the last 15 years. And the number of these displaced people has approached or now exceeded probably 100 million. These debates most commonly and most loudly are held in advanced economies, yet around 3/4 of internationally displaced persons actually end up in emerging market and developing economies, often neighbors. If you look at the ratios of these refugees to local populations, the highest ratios are in economies where we as EBRD work actively: Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Cyprus until recently, Czech Republic, Estonia on the back of recent conflict, Poland, but also economies like Peru, Colombia, that border Venezuela, and so on, and poorer economies in Africa. The wave of migration in Ukraine has seen around, by the time we were doing it, this analysis in late July, around 7 million people crossing borders, mostly with Poland. A lot of them went back. Significant numbers of them stayed. And I think what is different in this particular situation is that the attitudes to refugees, at least initially, has been warmer than historically among populations, and this can be seen in the surveys that were conducted in 2021 and in 2022. When we also conducted a survey of Ukrainian refugees, an online survey, trying to find them in various countries in Europe, and we surveyed almost 3,000 refugees. Overwhelmingly, they were fairly positive about support and welcome they have received from local populations, which actually doesn't happen to be very often. And they were, so this is actually the chart on that. And you see that actually issues such as homesickness and separation from family members were the primary concerns. In part, this reflects the fact that, and people were satisfied with the overall living conditions and support from local people. In part, that reflects some special provisions that were given with the right to work over the next 3 years that was implemented throughout European Union, differently in various countries, but in spirit, at least this was a fairly swiftly implemented provision that has been effective. If we step back and look at how refugee integration has worked in the region as of 2021, that varied, and on average, the integration policies have been somewhat weaker than in advanced European economies. These gaps, they vary from economy to economy. In some countries like Hungary or Bulgaria, language training support is virtually missing altogether in some countries, but on the other hand, the health benefits may be fairly generous. In other countries, access to housing is much more restricted, but say education access would be at par or ahead of what is provided in advanced economies. So this is a fairly mixed area, but certainly also an area where policies could be developed further and countries could learn from each other and see what has worked. In terms of where Ukrainian refugees actually went, in terms of municipalities inside Poland and so on, I think that a lot of it is driven by diaspora and who already settled where, and we do this analysis. A lot of it is driven actually to proximity to the border. People don't travel longer than they need to, and a lot of it is driven by work opportunities. And so counties with higher previous tax base as a reflection of income per capita tend to receive more refugees. But these also happen to be areas where accommodation tends to be more expensive and more scarce. And in the third chapter, we look at supply chain disruptions that we have experienced across our economies. And we do so combining macroeconomic data and also a survey of firms that we conduct. So what we've been doing throughout the years, together with the World Bank and European Investment Bank, we have been conducting enterprise surveys, surveys of a representative sample of countries across economies where we work. And so we took the last round of surveys that was typically conducted just before the COVID-19 pandemic. And we looked at firms that both export and import. And we tried to resurvey them on the phone this summer and see how they fared during the supply chain disruptions. And the advantage of that is that we could have a lot of baseline questions and information from the previous round of surveys, and we could really focus a short survey on these questions. And I will cover some of it here. But just to start by saying that the integration into global supply chains has been the cornerstone of economic convergence in much of the region about which this report is written, emerging Europe, North Africa, to a lesser extent Central Asia, because the economies basically have become much more integrated with the European Union, first and foremost, and as a result with global value chains. So when we looked at the results of the survey, we find that around half of the firms, and these are around 815 firms that both export and import across 15 economies that we surveyed here, and the response rate was around 60% or so, which was very nice to see, higher, I think, than these days than for the statistics agencies, at least in the United Kingdom. So the around half faced shipping issues, disruptions, and around half faced disruptions from suppliers. I think they were directly and indirectly related to war on Ukraine, China, and so on. Not that many firms trade with China directly. So 65% of firms that were surveyed don't have suppliers there, and around 20% of firms face disruptions. Also, I think worthwhile to point out that 11% of firms saw disruptions due to extreme weather. These take different forms in Europe. Some of them are related to forest fires and the like. A lot last summer was actually related to historically low levels of water in rivers such as the Rhine that stopped barge navigation for a couple of weeks, and so you can't get construction materials and other supplies that way. Around 10% of the firms were directly disrupted by the conflict, so with suppliers in Belarus, Russia, or Ukraine. Around 3/4 of firms took measures, and these measures differ. Increased inputs and sourcing the same input from a higher number of suppliers are fairly popular measures. Around, I think, 11% of firms in German data, we don't have comparable data for our region, they have moved to producing certain parts in-house, so basically to insourcing. And in our economies, close to 20%, I think 18%, replaced foreign supplier with the domestic supplier. Now, this result actually, I think, elicited most discussions and reactions internally to a lot of people who discuss friendshoring and reshoring. That sounded as a fairly low number. So you actually force firms through some disruptions to do something different, and they look for new suppliers. But 4 times out of 5, this new supplier is also somewhere abroad. On the other hand, if actually 20% gets reshored, in aggregate, that would be a very large number, if you think about it. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we should also have tried to figure out how many domestic suppliers might have been replaced with foreign suppliers, and that would have actually given us a fuller picture. And this is not what we have done in this survey. So we don't actually have a full context to put this number into, but nonetheless, I think, as always, it's a glass half empty here. I think there is some opportunity here in this rewiring of the supply chains. As part of the survey in Germany and in our regions, respondents were asked how they trust and how reliable do they find various suppliers. And suppliers from emerging Europe in terms of reliability came out reasonably high. I think suppliers in the former Soviet Union, actually Central Asia, get fairly low reliability scores. And then also in Germany, suppliers in Southeast Asia and China get relatively low reliability scores, whether it's a reflection of distance or COVID or longer term trends, we actually didn't ask on this occasion. So what you also see is that these issues have really spiked, but are by no means new. The concerns about supply chains predate the current disruptions, but nonetheless, that has gone up quite a bit. So what we do here is we mine transcripts of earning calls, the calls between investors, equity analysts, and company managers, in which different topics get discussed. And we process through machine learning various topics. And as you can see, the frequency with which supply chains have been discussed probably went up by a factor of 10 or so. The frequency of discussions of COVID has gone up and down more lately. The discussions of war and gas prices have spiked. And topics related to environment have been gradually going up, but not probably as drastically as some people describe it. We also did a separate analytical analysis in a box, a thought experiment, what would happen in a world with more extreme version of friendshoring, where you try to source components from like-minded countries. And here, to split the world into like-minded countries, the authors of the box looked at the vote on the at the UN on the invasion of Ukraine and split the world into economies that voted in favor and the rest, which are actually roughly equally sized blocks. And then we assumed basically a 20 percentage point increase in ad valorem tariffs between these blocks as just a modeling exercise of what would happen in this world. And you can see that the costs that are incurred by countries vary. The costs kind of range from probably 0.5% of GDP to near 5% of GDP in various scenarios, and depending on where the economies are, the costs tend to be higher for Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and parts of North Africa here. And basically, it's I think that it's in part it's obvious, in part it's just a reminder that these protectionist policies and friendshoring is an insurance. This is an insurance that may be very much justified when it comes to, say, energy security or other supply security issues that people value and governments value very highly. But it's also an expensive insurance, so it may not be justified for other sectors or other elements of trade where supply security may not be valued as highly. There is basically a price tag associated with that. Another exercise that we do in the report is we look at the impact of the proposals of the European Union to introduce what is called carbon border adjustment mechanism. A carbon border adjustment mechanism is a bit of a mouthful, but in essence, this is a levy applied at the border to compensate for the fact that the European Union has been running emission trading scheme internally that imports do not participate in. And so if you produce steel abroad, you don't need to pay a carbon tax. If you produce steel inside in Romania or Poland, you are subject to the carbon tax. And historically, quotas and exemptions have been granted, and now the plan is to phase those out and tax the carbon content at the border. So we are trying to look at what would happen to imports in these various countries. And for some of the countries, we have average carbon intensity of production in these various sectors: electricity, aluminum, cement, iron and steel, fertilizer. Mostly iron and steel and fertilizer here are important as more shippable goods. And in many countries, we don't have this data. And if this data cannot be achieved, then provided, then the rule says that the punitive rate of equivalent to the burst 10% of EU producers would be applied. And we look at some firms for which we have this data from the emissions data in Europe and from Orbis accounts. We try to find those 10% least efficient, most carbon intensive producers in Europe, and then extrapolate it. And basically, this is what we find here. And I think actually, for a lot of producers in our region, it is a significant constraint, where it would be probably about 15 to 40% of the price of exports to Europe, but also to a number of economies in Asia, India, Pakistan, in particular, in South Africa, has probably among the highest carbon intensity of steel production, and it's an important steel exporter. So this has a potential to do various things, to prompt countries to apply the tax domestically, for example, because what is taxed is the difference between carbon price in the EU and the carbon price applied domestically. So if India, say, match the EU carbon price domestically, at least all the revenue will accrue not to the EU authorities at the border, but to the Indian government for then redistributing it within India, and possibly for investment in energy efficiency, and so on, for example. There may be other responses as well. I'm happy to talk about it later. The fourth chapter deals with levels of the high levels of debt. A lot of debt has been accumulated during COVID and in the run-up to COVID. A lot of it is at highly favorable terms. And what we look at here is basically the issue with zombification. Companies that are financially weak, but at the same time have access to credit at very cheap rates. We refer to it as subsidized credit, and we reckon that in most cases it is. But we just do this exercise completely empirically. We find that 5 to 10% by asset values are zombie firms by this definition. This ratio has been fairly stable over time, but we only have data going to 2020. And basically, there has been a lot of support provided by governments in terms of repayment moratoriums and various subsidies. Banks that we surveyed here in 2020 as part of our banking survey that we do at the EBRD also reported that voluntarily they had a lot of forbearance vis-a-vis small and medium-sized enterprises. And as a result, actually very atypically for any major recession, bankruptcies have gone down drastically in advanced European economies, but they have gone down even more drastically in emerging Europe, although firm registrations have recovered and have been running as usual. So Ivan Krastev at our launch event in London, as one of the discussants of the report, said that clearly it was much better to be a company during COVID than a person, because among people, many people who should have stayed alive died, and among companies, many companies that should have died stayed alive. And that's basically, we discussed whether it is a concern or not so much of a concern. And I think at the moment, from the point of view of bank balance sheets, the banks are much better prepared. But what we find is that where we have a high share of zombies in the same sector and the same country, the healthy firms are less efficient and less productive. And personally, within a sector and country, I think that a lot of things can drive this correlation. But what we also find is that healthy firms have a lot lower investment rates and a lot lower employment growth rates in situations where they have a lot of zombies among their suppliers and off-takers. So when through supply chains, through the value chains, firms are connected to a lot of these firms that are artificially kept alive, they themselves become a lot less dynamic. And so this contagion throughout the economy has a significant cost. What we also look at is basically what supports this zombie ecosystem, as it were. And what we find are a few things, but basically the banks that are lending to zombies are much more likely to be state-owned banks and poorly capitalized banks. And I think the state ownership nexus there, I think, is a very here statistically and economically significant fact. And that's why we think that this, we look at it purely statistically as a cheap credit, but we think it's genuinely subsidized credit through state-owned bank lending. And the low capitalized banks, they tend to be in a weaker position to actually recognize non-performing loans and exposures that they don't need, that they need to write off if they recognize them. So the temptation to roll over these exposures to weak firms, not to face the problem on the balance sheet, at least for now, tends to be great. Now, when we look at in the last chapter at progress and reform in our regions, and we compare it to various preferences that people report in various areas of reform when they respond to world value surveys, which are representative surveys that are conducted in 120 countries around the world. I will not go through it in great detail, but basically we show a couple of things. One is that countries' progress and reform is actually reasonably aligned with preferences that people state. The preferences for green economy and other areas vary quite a bit. So we here work with the question, would you like to have less pollution if it means maybe less jobs and less economic growth? Or would you like to have more pollution if it means more jobs and more economic growth? And pro-environmental attitudes here actually vary a lot over time, but also over countries. There are countries like Sweden where almost 90% would tell you that environment is more important than growth, but there are countries like Japan on the other side of spectrum of advanced economies where actually pro-environmental preference is very low. It is even lower in economies like Lithuania, Egypt, or Latvia, where we work, or indeed very low in countries like Poland. So that actually gets reflected in green policies, and we show that. And the same can be observed for preferences for economic integration, migration, and so on. There is a lot of differentiation, and say economic integration preferences is somewhere where our economies compare favorably. So the economies covered in this report, in broad terms, welcome economic integration and migration and don't welcome green economy, basically, loosely speaking. We also look at the measures that have been adopted around economies in response to high, uniquely high gas prices in Europe and the neighborhood. And countries implemented subsidies per unit of consumption, probably at roughly the same frequency as advanced economies. Where economies really stand out is in the use of price controls. Price controls have been extremely popular in economies like Hungary, and predictably resulted in widespread shortages of fuel, of food staples in supermarkets, and so on. But somehow this history of managing the economy through price controls lives strong, and whether it's a legacy of central planning or central planning and that is a legacy of something deeper. We have had some interesting internal debates, but you certainly see it reflected in the data. We look at different policy objectives that these various measures try to pursue, and the responses, I think, are so different because there are so many things that governments want to achieve. You want to give benefits to the poor, but also in an affordable way, and in a way that will not result in overconsumption and undermine the green objectives. And you also want these policies to be broadly accepted and well communicated. And so we try to look at all of these, and basically the policy response in our regions is less green and less inclusive in terms of its affordability and maintaining resilience of economies, and in terms of governance and communication, it's very similar to advanced economies, but it's not as green, meaning there is much less attention paid to the incentives to consume at the margin, and it's less targeted towards the poor. And so what I would like to do in the remaining few minutes is maybe talk a little bit about Central Asia and the Caucasus in recent months, and a strong degree of economic resilience that we have seen. Probably to illustrate it with one chart, there have been very few economies globally where currencies have appreciated against the US dollar. The US dollar has been exceptionally strong, and the strongest since at least around 2000 against a broad basket of currencies. But currencies in a number of economies in emerging in Central Asia and the Caucasus have actually appreciated. And it's probably quite far from what most people internally and in London at least expected when Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. And so we'll look here at parts of the trends that drive that, and we'll look at monthly Comtrade data, aggregate and disaggregated to HS4 level, that is reported by various exporters. So here, this is a chart for what Germany reports, exporting to the world, to Russia, and to selected economies, Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, the Kyrgyz Republic. And what you can see is that the exports to the world have been roughly stable, have come a little bit down on global economic weakness. Exports to Russia, more than halved, but exports to Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyz Republic at the same time increased by around 60%. This increase has been very pronounced for the Kyrgyz Republic and Armenia. The trade to the Kyrgyz Republic basically quadrupled over these months. To Armenia, it tripled, and Kazakhstan similarly up, Georgia up a bit. And if you look at it, these are wider trends. They can be found for individual exporters, UK, US, Germany, but also EU, UK, and US as a whole. If you crunch partially available data from China Customs Administration, you will find some similar trends. And what is also probably interesting is that there are economies like Turkey that took advantage of the withdrawal of Western quote-unquote companies, and Turkey's trade with Russia and Belarus directly has gone up quite considerably. However, at the same time, Turkey's intermediated trade through Kazakhstan, Georgia, Armenia, the Kyrgyz Republic also has gone up by quite a bit. So you can see that exports from Turkey to the world have been up 20% in inflation-adjusted terms since pre-COVID times. Turkey has done well in that respect, but to Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and the Kyrgyz Republic, it's up by 45%. The geography of this intermediated trade is to a large extent driven by Eurasian Economic Union borders, which provide for customs free trade onwards to Russia, but also by the position of Georgia as the only land corridor from Armenia to Russia. And I was there in August, and it was interesting to drive the Georgia military highway from Tbilisi all the way to Verkhny Lars crossing and back, and to witness that shuttle trade. It's there, it's very visible, and certainly there is a vibrant ecosystem of massage parlors and whatnot along that highway, but very broadly speaking, all sorts of logistics and intermediation services. If you look at countries' own data on exports to Russia, those have also been sharply up since around May. And so now what gets intermediated through these economies is actually a small fraction of the decline in direct trade between European Union, US and UK and Russia. So if we add up this additional intermediated trade through Armenia, Kyrgyz Republic, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, it's less than 5% of the missing trade, quote unquote, something that is not exported directly to Russia from the same economies. However, in annualized terms, for Armenia and the Kyrgyz Republic, that amounts to 4 to 6% of GDP from these countries alone. And we have less extensive data, but it's looking similar for China and intermediated trade from China. So you could easily probably multiply this 4 to 6% of GDP by 2 or 2.5 to arrive at actually a value of this intermediated trade from all destinations. And then if you think that if your margin on this at least 25%, maybe closer to 30-50% in these services, because actually these car parts that get from Germany via Caucasus are probably in Russian service dealerships are sold at 3 times the price it used to be, then you actually end up with a quite substantial boost to GDP as well, in terms of not just trade going in and out, but that intermediation services that land in those economies. So part of this can be also seen in capital flows. These capital flows are trade settlements, but they're also probably Russians emigrating and taking money with them. This may be in part just expatriation of capital, all sorts of things. But these are net flows into Georgia. They have been very stable until February, March this year. And then they have increased by a factor of many, many times. And this, of course, also underpins the currency appreciation. So this is the illustration of the trade from Turkey to Russia that has increased much over time. But the trade from EU to Turkey doesn't really show much abnormally. So I think that unlike intermediated trade through Central Asia, the trade that goes from Turkey to Russia, this extra trade, genuinely originates in Turkey, or at least most of it, even though Turkey has a customs union within Europe, and theoretically you could also imagine shipping things from Europe to Turkey to ship from Turkey to Russia. Now, what's driving this? I think it's a combination of factors. There are sanctions in strict sense. They cover certain prohibited items in terms of technology, professional services, or particular counterparties in Russia. There is a large list of companies withdrawing voluntarily from Russia. And there is an issue with the ease of cross-border payments. For compliance reasons, payments have become harder to make and may take many weeks or months to clear. So an alternative is making a payment from, say, Russia to Kazakhstan or Georgia, and then from Kazakhstan and Georgia onwards to a clearing bank, a correspondent bank somewhere in Germany or in the United States. I think all of these can come together. The trade from China in aggregate terms showed a similar pattern, but has largely recovered to the normal pre-conflict levels of trade between Russia and China. There is also some evidence that China has gained market share, in particular when it comes to machinery and equipment. The trade from European Union has not really shown much sign of recovery, at least not yet in the data. But again, what we see for China, and the breakdown is only available for Russia and Kazakhstan. If you look at China trade to Kazakhstan, it's a similar picture. A lot of it is up, in particular in manufacturing goods and machinery. But if you put trade from China to Russia and Kazakhstan together, that actually makes little difference relatively to the to the chart of China to Russia here on the left. So again, a bit like in the earlier analysis, this intermediated trade through Central Asia is important for Central Asia, but not so much for total flows of China to Russia trade. There has been quite a bit of coverage about whether it may amount to working around certain sanctions goods in Bloomberg, say, in other press. People have picked up on extraordinary increase in shipments of things like breast pumps and cheap fridges to Central Asia. And the hypothesis is that these contain cheap chips that can be used for something else. I think the chip shortages within Russia are real. Whether this intermediated sort of trade in chips is real or not is hard to tell. But when we looked at decrease in direct exports of certain goods at HS2 and HS4 disaggregation from EU, US, and UK to Russia, and then increase in exports from these destinations to Central Asia, and also increase in exports of these goods from Turkey to Russia directly. Pretty much nothing comes close to the 45-degree line. So you would actually see that the drop in direct exports of, say, Bosch and Siemens, etc., Electrolux fridges to Russia actually exceeds whatever gets intermediated through Central Asia by quite a bit of margin. So in this aggregate data, it's actually hard to find evidence that the overall trade in fridges, as it were, is abnormal. And if you look at, in particular, trade in goods that that recorded abnormal pattern, it's a mix of everything under the sun. There are toys and metal tools and textiles and fabrics and aircraft parts here. So I think basically this intermediated trade is a mix of everything. This is just to show that also there have been a lot of companies that voluntarily restricted trade to Russia, and some of them just leaving means doing it through a subsidiary in Turkey or in UAE. So Zara, the clothing brand, for example, now does its Russia business through UAE subsidiary rather than through its Italian branch. And as in part to deal with all of this, there have been also a very significant increase in Russian-owned companies setting shop in Central Asia and the Caucasus, in particular in Kazakhstan, where a lot of professional services firms moved. And you can see here that it's not the quirk of registration data. So you can see that the number of companies with foreign ownership from Turkey or China is significant but unchanged since January 2022, whereas already between January and May 2022, a significant thousands of new Russian-owned companies have been registered in Kazakhstan. The other major development on the back of this rerouted and redeveloped trade is that Russia's share in offshore yuan settlements went from 0 to 4% by July of 2022, and that puts Russia into third place worldwide after Hong Kong, which accounts for 70% plus, and United Kingdom, that London is still a major financial center, in particular for not directly Brexit-related financial services. Now, the last thing I wanted to say is that this pattern of intermediated trade is not something that you would always naturally find. When we repeat this exercise for reimposition of Iran sanctions in 2018, we actually do not find that there are some patterns, but basically trade through neighboring countries that could be suitable conduit, Azerbaijan, Iraq, Afghanistan, and others listed here, actually behaved roughly the same as trade with the world. In part, this is probably reflects a collapse in purchasing power of Iran, and in part the imposition of secondary sanctions by the US and others in that instance in relation to Iran. So I will stop here. I'm sorry for taking more time. I thought I wanted to share our latest Central Asian Caucasus work as well, given that this is the region we cover in common. I would very much hope to hear some questions and reactions from the audience. I see a couple of questions. One is that about the fact that only 20% of states experience peace after 25 years of conflict. Whether it is due to countries' re-establishment of institutions or something else. Now, on institutions, it's actually very interesting. We also did this analysis, and it also very much depends on how you look at it. The major institutional improvements that and building of strong governance actually happen after major conflicts, but an exception, it's not the norm. I think the norm is that actually institutional change for the better doesn't happen. Sometimes institutional change happens for the worse, and on average, you don't find really a result. However, what is also true is that when major institutional progress does happen, those post-conflict situations provide those critical junctions that actually help this change happen. So these become a little bit of a now or never situations where this major institutional improvement can happen and happens, but it happens in a majority, in a small minority of cases. So you think about, probably countries like Italy have come out institutionally and economically a lot stronger out of the Second World War, say, and the Marshall Plan played a major role. So these kind of examples in this now or never situation is basically never is much more likely than now. But if this now happens, it does happen after the wars. And I think therein lies also a sort of if you look at it, policy takeaways from this, is that countries do need a lot of effort in supporting this institutional transformation after the conflict, because although it's a small chance, it's a chance worth taking because there is no better time. And also countries need a lot of front-loaded and grant-heavy assistance just because they're so overburdened with debt coming out of the war, that that assistance would be very useful. Now, why countries actually fall back into conflicts? Well, a lot of them, I think, are deeply unresolved issues that give rise to those wars, often civil wars in the first place. It's just the conflict fails to resolve them, and so it goes over again. An economy like that in our region would be Lebanon. It has a lot of internal contradictions and conflicts and a series of civil wars, and the conflicts are still there. The other question is, do you think that I only see another question. Do you think that institutional quality factors are key to private sector risk overcoming current global challenges such as post-pandemic recovery, complexities of supply chains? What can be done to overcome this energy transition? I think, of course, we need to build stronger institutions, and it's true that it's the main element to it. But I think a lot can be done in how policies are designed. To give one example, maybe, what is a better way to design energy subsidies, because prices in Europe at some point for gas were 7 times higher than in the United States, and these subsidies are widely seen as necessary for industrial and individual consumers. I think what you would like to do is to give, for example, something approximating lump sum subsidies per household for energy consumption. these are subsidies that would give a certain amount per month to everyone, and maybe a higher amount per month to low-income households. This will be much more important in relative terms, much more important help to low-income households that consume less energy, and at the same time they don't change the high marginal price of gas that households face, because the marginal price doesn't get subsidized. It's the fixed amount per month. As a result, you still have incentive to cut on energy consumption, and you still have incentives to pursue green policy and think maybe about how you switch heating from gas to hydrogen eventually. That also makes these policies more affordable and easier to communicate. So these are the kind of policies that we would like to see, and yet when we look at what gets implemented across economies, this is probably the minority of economies that actually implement this. So the report has much more material on how actually you can go about reconstructions and how you can go about energy policy and what governments can do for supply chains. But even with existing institutions, a lot can be done.
Alexander, thank you so much for sharing about EU carbon adjustment mechanism. I'm actually interested on the impact of EU carbon adjustment mechanism on exporting countries. I saw your nice graph. I noticed that Kazakhstan and People's Republic of China were on the right side, probably because they already have emission trading scheme, right? So what the cost of this policy for exporting countries, I guess, will depend on carbon intensity and the existing policy, right? And also you mentioned that revenue might go back to countries, like you mentioned India, right? So how this will affect countries? They might be discouraged to have national carbon pricing, right? If they can get revenue from EU, because EU probably more efficient at collecting revenue. So I'm interested in this. What will be impact? Thank you.
Absolutely.
One more question.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for your very informative presentation. My question is that you are working for currently EBRD, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know that the EBRD is actively supporting the Ukraine and the other countries which are affected by the Ukraine war. So I think you also mentioned in your presentation that government support or low interest rate loan to the zombie companies could cause a very negative spillover effect for healthy companies. In that context, I think that the EBRD's strong support to the European countries could bring some kind of negative effects on the zombie companies, and as you said, the negative spillover effect for healthy companies. What is your view on my?
Excellent.
Yeah.
I love the question. I think whether EBRD supports zombies, is I think we have to tackle that. Very briefly. So on carbon adjustment mechanism, I think there are several dimensions to it. One element where countries would have to do a lot of work to work with these schemes is actually mechanisms for certifying these carbon emissions, just having the data. This is not trivial in many cases, and the differences in this chart are often between countries that have the data already, or mechanisms of collecting it, and countries that have no obvious such mechanisms at the moment. In particular, for small and medium-sized enterprises, the cost of the certification may not be negligible, and this is one dimension of it. The other dimension is upgrading technology to be more competitive in a way where greenery is important. And one aspect that we, I think, as EBRD institutionally would very much support is taking these levies collected in the European Union at the border when they start getting collected, and putting it into a climate fund specifically to fund technological upgrading and energy efficient investment in those exporting countries, so that this money collected at the border can be used to help those producers, but ultimately help environmental improvements around the world and the greening. So I think all this, there is a lot to be done to think about the details of these schemes, and thirdly, of course, governments domestically can do the same. When they tax, they can establish, using that tax, it can be ring-fenced, and funds can be established for supporting technological upgrading. On whether the special lending programs like EBRD, because ultimately EBRD is not exactly a state-owned bank, but it is a bank owned by 70 states or so. So what we have been very careful to do in our 30 years of history is exactly not to do the kind of subsidized lending that we criticized here. And when we do provide something that looks like a sweet deal, usually this sweet component is specifically for a kind of impact, which can be environmental impact or some other externalities that we think market cannot finance. The core, the kind of the vanilla side of any transaction that we do has always been priced to market, and it remains so. It would probably remain so even in Ukraine, although a lot of grant component will be needed for reconstruction and for green economy investment and so on. So I think where we can square the need for this is to have very clear distinction between the use of proceeds that address certain externalities and merit subsidies, and the part of the use of proceeds that does not merit any subsidies.
Okay, Alex, thank you very much for your comprehensive answers. I think we have now run out of time. So thank you to all participants for the questions. And Alex, once again, thank you very much for your comprehensive presentation on this topic and for your answers to the questions that were posed. That's the end of this seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for excellent questions as well and for the discussion. It's been a pleasure.